Hi, everybody. So today we're going to talk about chapter 5. Let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get into it. We're going to talk about attitudes and persuasion, but we'll get to persuasion. All right. So when we talk about attitudes, we're talking about basically the things that we are making assumptions, or I think they call it evaluations of in your textbook. So anything that you think, hey, anything from I don't like that ice cream flavor to this is my favorite author to that person makes me feel uncomfortable. All of these things are attitudes. They're all evaluations of what is going on around us and or things that we have preferences about, whether we like or dislike or hate or love. Anything that we have those kinds of feelings or associations with are going to be the things that we are going to call attitudes. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. In this particular chapter, we're going to talk about attitudes. We're going to talk about how those then shape our behavior. And then we're going to talk about persuasion and how things like ads can change our attitudes or our behaviors about a certain topic, or persuasions from maybe peers can change our attitudes towards someone or something. Okay. And so we're going to get into all of that and how they impact essentially our social interaction, right? Because what we're doing in this class is really all following everything back to how we then socially interact with others, or how we end up presenting ourselves to others based on our likes, preferences, attitudes, etc. All right, so the definition in our book of an attitude is our relatively enduring evaluation of something. So, meaning that it's not just like that snap decision, it's the snap decision that then stays in your brain, right? So, we talked about earlier in the semester those inferences we make, those snap decisions we make in a second. They're different than attitudes in the sense that attitudes then stay around, right? So, we're not making that snap decision and then going on with life and that snap decision is now done. We're taking that attitude or that preference, and then it's going to imply some kind of behavior later. So, this is again going back to ice cream, because why not? My favorite ice cream flavor is, well, it's actually the Reese's ice cream, but it didn't used to be, right? So, it can change, your attitudes can change. However, that attitude I have about this ice cream wasn't just the snap decision when I ate it the first time, but then it was in my insistence in buying it again that it created that attitude towards it, right? That preference for that specific flavor. And that's kind of the difference, right? Okay, so there's several components to what creates an attitude. So you have your cognitive functions, right? Your thoughts and your beliefs, your affective functions, which are really your feelings or emotions. So things that draw on particular kinds of emotions, and your behavior. So that actions, intentions, what you're going to do with that attitude, right? All of these things essentially influence how we create and then how we maintain and or change our attitudes towards something or someone. Okay, so the strength of an attitude will depend on a lot of things, right? It'll depend on your experiences in life. It'll depend on how many times you may have to come in contact with said thing or said person. And all of these things are going to create either stronger or weaker kind of interactions, right? So, for instance, my ice cream flavor, yes, it is something that I do like. However, if something else comes along later that changes my attitude towards what ice cream flavor is my favorite, then that attitude was not really, really strong, right? Because that attitude was capable of changing with one sample of some other kind of ice cream, right? Does that make sense? Whereas my attitude towards, say, my kids and what I think of our relationship, that attitude is much stronger because people could come in and talk to me about my kids or say something negative to me about my kids, but my relationship to them is going to almost always give my kids the benefit of the doubt because I have a stronger attitude towards the personalities and or the people that are associated with that attitude, right? So my kids, that attitude is a very, very strong one. My perception of them is going to be much stronger than, say, maybe my favorite ice cream flavor that is currently Reese's, but could change at another given a better flavor of ice cream, right? So these things are going to have varying strengths, and it's going to be harder to convince me to change my attitude on something that I have a very strong uh, emotional response to or a very strong position on. It's going to be much harder to persuade me to do something else. And most of that is because that attitude has already been formed and bonded with certain emotions. It's been formed and bonded with certain interactions that I already feel very strongly about. Right. So these things are going to change. And depending on the strength, it's going to take more persuasion or more of a situation or an influence to change a attitude if you have a much stronger feeling about it. And that makes sense. All right. So we form attitudes on based on a couple of things. So we have genetic predispositions, which I think so one that gets talked about a lot is addiction, right? So you might have a predisposition towards addiction. That could impact maybe your view on alcohol or your view on any kind of recreational activity usage of drugs, mostly because if you have a genetic predisposition and you're aware of it, which you may or may not be, your likelihood to form an attitude that there's a positive association with this thing from that predisposition of addiction could influence how strong that tie to that particular thing is. But on the other hand, if you're aware of your genetic predisposition, it also might influence your attitude to not want to engage in those behaviors because you already know you're predisposed to have issues with quitting or not doing those activities, right? So just because you have a genetic predisposition does not mean that that's going to automatically give you a strong adherence to that attitude. It might actually give you a strong refusal to want to do a certain behavior because you know that that could cause problems for you, right? So I wanted to kind of use that as an example because I want you to understand that genetic predispositions don't automatically mean that that person is going to go and do that thing that they're predisposed to do. It might mean that they have a very strong reaction to not do that thing so that they don't fall into some kind of pattern of behavior they don't see as part of their self-concept or something they want to be, right? They're also learned through direct experiences, right? So if you form an attitude about a person and you have direct experiences with said person that reinforce that attitude's going to get stronger, right? It's going to not only keep building on the feelings associated with the attitude that you have created for that person or that your perception, right? But it's also going to make it harder to change kind of how you interact or how you see that person. On the flip side, if you make a snap decision, say, and then you interact with this person again several times, and that attitude might form differently than your initial perception. And that might be because, hey, look, I keep feeling or associating a different understanding of this person the more I'm around them, right? And that, again, like any attitude, depending on how you are interacting with the thing or the person or the predisposition, all of those things are going to create emotions and create feelings for ourselves and create cognitive connections. And we're going to form attitudes based on those. You're also going to have cultural influences, media exposure, and we're going to get more into media exposure when we talk about ads. But cultural influences might be something to the extent of In the US, we have a very individualistic idea of personhood, right? Our person is us, and we do things that make or break or determine our situation. Whereas in some cultures, there's very much a culture based on society or group. So maybe they are not necessarily making decisions based on how much they're going to improve their life, but how much the group will benefit. And those kind of things will determine essentially some attitudes and how you might interact with said thing or person or people. And that's, again, going to be based on experiences you might have again, but also those cultural influences like these norms and beliefs that you have been taught maybe from very very young, right, due to the culture you're in. And no, none of them are right or wrong, and we're not going to get into that, but um it does directly impact the way in which we cognitively think about forming attitudes, right? So if you think about forming an attitude based on how it will impact yourself versus how it will impact a group, that's going to naturally have different variations on how that attitude formation will happen, right? Okay. So there are things that help communicate in persuasion, and then there's things that maybe won't be as effective, right? Things that are effective generally are when communicators are attractive, trustworthy, possess some kind of expertise. So, right, you're going to look at your doctor to give you health advice, um, right? And you're going to think, okay, this doctor probably knows more about this particular topic because that's something he went to school for or she went to school for. But you're not going to necessarily go to this doctor for dating advice, right? Because those two things don't necessarily have the same hold, right? That he might be able to persuade you to try a new medication, but he's probably not likely to persuade you to go on a blind date with some random person he knows, right? These two things are a difference in expertise. And so we look at people and kind of examine what we think they should have expertise on or what they might know and how trustworthy they are and how they appeal to us. And then we decide essentially whether or not that persuasion or the thing they're trying to convince us of or the thing an attitude they're trying to change or even establish further is going to work. All right. We're also, if the message that someone is trying to give or to influence an attitude, right, comes up against strong values or beliefs in a person, you are much less likely to be able to persuade them. And that mostly comes from the fact that if there's something that they already have a very strong emotional bond to, people are more likely to keep those, whether or not someone from an expertise or someone they trust is talking to them to try to change it, right? And that's because when we tie attitudes that are very, very strong, generally we tie them to our image of self, or we tie them to our image of something very important to us, say religion, or say culture, or our educational experience, or our self, right? Like if somebody came up to me and said, Professor Bowen, I don't think that you are very smart, and here's why I'm going to tell you this. You're going to have to come up with some really persuasive arguments to me because I would have to change my self image of me and all of the work I have done in academia to obtain all of this information and knowledge to change that idea that I am not smart, right? That I am not capable or what have you, that I've attached to that, right? Because I have strong feelings about the idea that I have worked really hard to acquire so much knowledge. Um, on the flip side of that, now say I am much older and a doctor is running some tests because my cognitive function is not working the way that I have perceived or as a norm for myself, right? If I'm used to, say, coming up with a memory very quickly, and now I'm in here having tests about my memory, then I may change my idea of self as smart to something else because this doctor might have to tell me that I have Alzheimer's or what have you. Now, that still might come as attention, but at some point, the likelihood of persuasion is going to be there because the evidence and the behaviors and the things that I see are going to change, right? And again, that does not mean that that wouldn't come up with serious issues, right? That wouldn't come with a serious fight because that's scary, right? When we change, anytime we change a very big attitude or perception that we have or something that we tie to self, we are making changes that can be to some degree detrimental to our mental health, mostly because we might be changing who we think we are in order to accept or not to accept a particular influence to change our attitudes, right? And that's not to say that that won't eventually be a better thing. It's to say that when one has strong feelings about something or tied to something or someone, it takes a very long, well, not necessarily a long time, but a lot of influence, a lot of persuasion to change that perception. And we're going to talk about this a lot when we get into media, because media is really good at figuring out how to push those buttons to change our self or the way we view self in a way that benefits whoever or whatever they're trying to advertise for. And we'll get into that. So I think I've talked about this, but okay, we also let's talk about this real quick. We process persuasion in one of two ways, either spontaneously or thoughtfully. If we're doing it spontaneously, it's like, okay, this person's trying to persuade me of something. Here it is. I'm going to give you a yes or no, right? Like this is going to be like, am I going to take this information or am I not? If I'm sitting in a classroom, I'm going to maybe take this information because it might be on a test later and I need to have it, right? Or if I'm coming across some person who is protesting something that I am very adamant on, right? That I believe in, I'm going to just kind of walk away and I already know that they're not going to change my mind, right? So those are very spontaneous. Those are things that you're not going to really think about. But say you come into a situation where a friend sets you down and says, hey, this person that we both know that maybe I already have a positive image of has done some kind of harm to me. Well, now you might need to sit back, think about it a little bit, because that's going to change your perception of a person in a way that you're going to want to make sure you're doing it correctly, or you're going to want to really navigate this in a way that doesn't hurt you as much, right? And that's natural, that's normal. You might also go into a classroom thinking that you know something about a topic, and then the professor, walks you through maybe how something is different, and that ends up being something you need to go home, kind of reflect on and see if, okay, maybe this professor has a point and maybe I need to think this through, right? So there's ways in which we think about things. Sometimes we're making those quick judgment calls, and then sometimes we're going to need to sit, we're going to need to process, we might need to sleep on it. These things are going to help us to change maybe our attitude or decide that even with this evidence, maybe it's still not there, right? And so there's multiple ways in which we process these persuasions. But again, when somebody comes in that you trust and has expertise that maybe you think favorably of, they're more likely to be able to get that persuasion or get whatever it is to persuade you in some way. All right. Preventing persuasion. So I put this in here because we have a lot of ways that we prevent persuasion. Some of them are good for us and some of them may not. It depends on what somebody's trying to persuade you. If somebody's trying to persuade you that, hey, this diagnosis of Alzheimer's is really real and you really do need to think about it, that's going to be harder for somebody to maybe not prevent because they don't want that diagnosis, or that diagnosis consists of a serious change in their life, than maybe somebody saying, hey, come buy this thing, right? Those are going to have different ways of preventing. Um, and in some ways, we do this that we do this in ways that may not always be good for us, right? Sometimes we prevent something from coming in because it goes against maybe a belief system, regardless of evidence or what have you that comes and is presented to you by any kind of person with expertise. And that again is going to because fall back into having those very, very strong attitudes, right? That's the number one way to prevent persuasion, is that your attitudes are very set in stone. Now, I'm going to challenge you that that's not always a good thing, because you're going to go through life and find that most attitudes that you have a scale or some wiggle room, or aren't just, you see this and that's that and that's fact, or you see something else and that can't possibly be true, right? There's always going to be navigation, and I challenge you as humans to not get into a place where your attitudes are so strong that there is never going to be evidence or never going to be a person that's going to ever be able to change them, because again, then we're not learning, right? Learning is a change in attitude perception. And so as an educator, I'm just letting you know that being able to prevent persuasion in some ways is really good, but in some ways might work against us. Okay. All right. So you have forewarning, which is really just giving people a chance to develop a resistance, right? You're telling somebody, hey, you know that these ads are going to come on at this point in the program or at this minute mark in the YouTube video or what have you. And so, you know what? Because I know they're going to come on and I don't want to be persuaded by them, I'm going to mute them and I'm going to walk away. I'm going to go get my water. I'm going to go do my thing and I'll be right back. Right. That is essentially, I was forewarned that this is coming because I know it's coming. And so now I can not be persuaded by them because I'm choosing not to engage in that particular interaction. Right. Okay, so the next one involves just building up defenses against persuasion by mildly attacking an attitude or position. So we see a lot of this in politics today, where somebody has a really strong belief about any of the hot button topics. I'm not going to pick one because we're not going to get into that today. um, and so they decide that the best way of reinforcing their own attitude is to attack the position of the other person or the other party or what have you, because that is much easier than trying to navigate this. They may not be right and I may not be right, and maybe there's somewhere here, right? Or maybe I'm wrong, but this backs up to a very specific feeling I have, and so I don't want to engage in this particular conversation. And so I'm building up those positions by essentially denying someone's expertise or denying someone's trustworthiness or denying the attitude or position in general in a way that is attacking or is not necessarily kind, right? Not always, but mostly it's about tearing down as opposed to listening, right? And then you have a psychological reactance, which is that strong emotional response that we have or we experience when we feel like our freedom of choice is being taken away from us, or when we expect or that we should have it, right? So these are situations which, again, you can see in some political situations. You can also see this in individual dynamics, so relationships. If you feel like you should have the freedom to do X, Y, or Z, and your partner says, well, I'm uncomfortable with that. So if you do X, Y, or Z, we can't be together, then there's going to be this, okay, I'm going to prevent persuasion by saying, I'm going to do this. And regardless of said consequences, right? And maybe that's the correct answer, right? Sometimes it's going to be, hey, I feel like this thing that I want to do is something that I have a right to do. And maybe we could talk about it and I could persuade you to see that that right is important to me, right? And maybe that works. Um, but this is definitely I have a very strong reaction. I feel like a right I have is being taken away or freedom is being taken away, and I don't like it. And so I'm going to back up against whatever it is that I have that view of, and we're going to stay there. Okay. And then the last thing is just that, say the person that's trying to persuade you or the entity, because sometimes it's a media company or sometimes it's a group or what have you. Um, Sometimes they're just insufficient justification for why you should be persuaded into whatever it is. That happens. Sometimes it's just not there, or sometimes there's an over significance justification. So sometimes somebody's coming into this with so much that there's kind of this overwhelmed, wait, nope, I'm going to back up off this. Okay. So it's kind of, again, you can see how these could be very positive things depending on what it is, or you could see how some of these things could maybe go against our self image of ourselves or go against what it is we're trying to accomplish. Okay. All right. So changing attitudes through behavior. So anytime you interact with somebody or you're having a conversation or what have you, you're going to have um, things that either change or reinforce kind of an attitude you may already have, right? So the self-perception theory is that we use our own behavior as a guide to help us determine our thoughts, our own thoughts and feelings, right? So we're essentially going to walk through the world the way we think we should, right? Or the way we think we should in any given situation. And that's kind of going to determine our thoughts and feelings about the surrounding things, including maybe interactions we have, including what should be there and what shouldn't, etc. So if you walk into a classroom, right, and then you sit down at a desk, the assumption is for you that you're about to be there, and either you're in there for a class or you're in there as some kind of training thing for work or whatever the reason you're in that building. If you're going into a room, sitting at a desk and getting ready, then the likelihood is that you're going to have this idea that you're coming into some kind of experience to learn something. Now, if you come into this room that you know you're supposed to have this class or this training in, and there's no desks, there's no chairs, there's no pencils, there's no computers, nothing that you would think would be there. There's no blackboard, there's no whiteboard, right? Like nothing that is in there looks like a classroom, right? Then you're going to have this idea that, wait a minute, I'm walking into this to be educated, but this does not look like it is set up for that, or that I'm having the attitudes that I thought I was going to see, right? The behaviors that I had walking into this with the idea that I was going to learn aren't coming to fruition because of the stuff not being there, because of the behavior of whoever it was that was going to do the educating had not set up a space to do that, or they may not be there themselves. So things feel really off, or they don't fit the behavior that you are doing, right? They don't fit this idea and this attitude that you have about what your expectation is for walking into a classroom. I think hopefully that I explained that well. I'm gonna go back. I'm gonna do cognitive dissonance last. But then there's also attitude adjustment, and that's just to mitigate the discomfort from cognitive dissonance. Individuals often adjust their attitudes to better match their behaviors, leading up to a more consistent self perception, right? So when you have cognitive dissonance, you have this discomfort that occurs when we behave in ways that we see as inappropriate, or such as when we fail to live up to our own expectations. So I know cognitive dissonance also comes up in political, and I will use that example in just a second, but let's get to a more personal example, so that you can understand how this could be on a more societal level, and then also could be on a more individual level, right? So say I go in to do my vision test, or to do my, oh, what are they called? The part of the driver's test where you have to tell what the signs are, right? I've been driving for a very, very long time. I feel like I know these signs, but maybe I go in there and I just, for whatever reason, my vision isn't up to snuff and I fail the test. Okay. I'm going to feel that cognitive dissonance of, but wait a minute, I've been doing this forever. And I know the majority of my life I've been able to drive. I know these signs and I failed to meet that expectation. So I'm going to have that cognitive dissonance of, yeah, no, this isn't right. Let's do this again, or something's off, or I don't believe that I don't know this thing because I already have such a strong idea that I, as a, myself, know the rules of the road and know the signs that you come up against when you're driving, right? So that cognitive dissonance might end up with me having that attitude adjustment of, maybe I need to wear glasses so that I can see them better. And it's not me not knowing what the signs are. It was just me struggling with being able to see them. Okay. This is going to create that adjustment that then allows for me to keep that same self image without having to change what happened. Right. So, hey, this thing happened. It butted up against what I already know to be true. What's an alternative? I'm going to choose that because obviously what I already know to be true is still true, right? Okay. So now we're going to get into a societal way this works, because it, again, bites us in the butt sometimes. So I'm trying to pick a thing that's going to be less hot button topic. Let's choose, okay, let's go with marijuana, the legalization of marijuana. Okay. Because that one's not as hot button as it used to be. Say I have this idea, right, that it should be legal because it's, I don't know, X, Y, and Z. Doesn't matter the reasons, right? I have a very strong core value belief that marijuana should be legalized, right? And then say I read something that says that new studies have found that marijuana has been the leading cause or the leading drug or what have you in recent DUIs, right? So driving under the influence. So people are now that we've said legalize this and have got the thing that I've cognitively stood behind, but now it's having this negative impact in society where DUIs, where someone is under the influence of marijuana, are now much higher. Okay. So now I have to come up with this reckoning in my brain. Okay. But I was very strongly believe that this should be legal, right? But this bad thing is happening. So how do I come to terms with that? How do I attitude adjust that allows me to keep this? I definitely think it should be legalized. And maybe that attitude adjustment is, okay, so maybe we need to come up with better, I don't know, laws regarding the usage of marijuana, and like we have an alcohol level, right? That that you cannot be over while you're driving. Okay. Maybe we need a level or some way of measuring marijuana usage or the amount of THC we have in our system while driving, so that it's not either you are under the influence of marijuana, so you are obviously get a DUI, or you are not and have not done any marijuana, so you do not need a DUI, right? So maybe my brain is coming up with alternative solutions to this problem that has arisen from this political or societal idea that I had, right? And so now my brain is saying, okay, this can be right. This this thing that's butting up against can be right, but I have a solution, so it's fine. I don't have to change my view. Now, where this comes into play in society in a negative way, right? So, I mean, that could be negative, but in a grand scheme of things, what might happen is, hey, I have this attitude or belief about a certain group of people where I do not have this belief, but I'm going to use it as an example. I believe that all Black people are criminals. Okay. Something comes up to you where you meet a Black person that is not a criminal, that is amazing, that isn't a human who maybe saved your butt from some other threatening situation, right? Now I have this thing, this positive experience with this Black person. And I have this very strong belief that Black people are criminals, are not okay, are a threat. These two things come and collide, right? That cause that cognitive dissonance. And so your brain decides that, no, it's just this one Black person that's okay, but I'm going to keep this belief, right? That cognitive dissonance has now led you to a place where you are going to probably have serious interaction problems in society, right? As you come across different people of different races, that you have now created for yourself, as opposed to adjusting your attitude in a way where you can accommodate this idea that Black people are not all bad, right? Because that's not accurate, right? I can give you copious amounts of material, of ideas, of information, of data that proves that that's not okay. But if you have this cognitive dissonance where you're going to say, well, I had this one interaction, so that guy's good, but the rest of them are bad, then you're going to create problems for not only yourself, but you're creating that cognitive dissonance that disallows you to be a member of society that works with other people from other cultures, okay, of other backgrounds, that fails to see or to hear other people. And that's not always good, especially in a sociology context, because that's what we're doing, right? We're learning about society, about rules, about judgments, about perceptions, and how they influence our interactions with others. Okay, so this is, I gave you a big societal and an individual and a one based on a bias, that all would show how that cognitive dissonance works, right? And so hopefully that helps you guys understand it. If you have questions, please come ask me, right? Also, as I'm going to say this one more time, I do not believe that particular attitude, right? That is not a self-perception. I wanted to understand a bias in a way that gave you an example to show how that might negatively impact a whole lot. Okay. All right. Oh, well, we're just going to skip right through these because we already talked about them. All right. What's next? Okay. So we're getting kind of towards the end here. We're going to talk about and kind of wrap it up. Analyzing attitudes is essential when anytime we're doing any kind of decision making, especially when we're doing decision making based on buying or selling of something, because they shape how we interact with whatever that item is, or whatever company that is, etc. All right. So is this back to the beginning? No. Okay. This is just a wrap up. And they talked about ads a whole lot. I think that based on the other kind of topics that we talked about, we could talk about why certain ads are persuasive. They might be feeding on an insecurity or an emotion that you already have, or they are trying to talk about or get you to buy a certain thing to be included, right? To be like other people, etc. So those things are going to be either more persuasive or less, depending on how much you want to interact with whatever it is their emotional pool that they're giving, right? All right. So again, we talked about, just to wrap up, our definitions of attitudes are enduring. There's something that's not just a snap decision, but it's a snap decision that then later could turn into a behavior or something that we are going to pull from and make, they're going to change how we interact with the world, right? They hold they could be people, groups, objects, um, ideas, all sorts of things you can have an attitude about. Okay. And they're based on your cognitive dispositions, your emotions, and they're also based on your interactions and your behaviors. All right. You can change attitudes based on persuasion. Again, persuasion is going to happen much more likely if someone is likable or you find them enjoyable to look at, that you feel like they're trustworthy and that they're credible in some way or hold some kind of expertise about it. Cognitive dissonance, which we just talked a lot about, arises when there's like that thing that comes up against something you believe in very strongly. Okay. And it's going to result in making you feel uncomfortable. And that discomfort is going to have you either continue that strong core belief, or it's going to have you kind of try to figure out, and if you do, it'll make you try to figure out an alternative solution that both lets you hold that strong belief and deal with whatever is being presented to you, or it's going to have you change maybe that strong belief a little bit to allow for the new information or new situation you've been put into. And it's important to kind of understand where these come from or how we might butt up against them or how we might be persuaded into having them, because the way the attitudes that we bring also contribute to our biases, to our perceptions, and they then impact our interactions, right? Our behavior in certain contexts or in all contexts, depending on the attitudes that you have. So it can make your life harder. It can sometimes make your life a lot easier. But this process, nonetheless, is something that all of us as humans are going to do, right? We're going to form an attitude about something, and it's going to impact how we then engage with whatever that thing, person, group, idea is. Okay. All right. So that's chapter 5. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I hope that that helps. If it doesn't, or if you have questions, as always, please feel free to come talk to me and we will get it worked out. All right. Have a good rest of your day.